Hi, everybody. Welcome to the November 7th, 2014 edition of Colorado Inside Out. I'm your host, Dominic Dezzutti. Thank you very much for joining us. It's our big post-election special. So let's begin by asking our panelists, if you had one word to describe election night, what would it be? Lynn Bartles, ace go-to reporter from the Denver Post. What's your one word for election night?
Fascinating.
Fascinating. I like that one. David Kopel from the Independence Institute and DU Law School. What do you say?
Surveyor. It's the reason that Lynn hasn't been able to go to sleep, because the election's still not over. They're counting the Adams votes, and the reason they're going slow is nobody ran for county surveyor, so people are writing it in, and that slows things down a lot. So election night is still with us.
That's true. Election week. Eric Sondman, political analyst. What's your one word?
Lynn surprised me here. I figured her word would be uterus. She defined the campaign with that word. I'll go with the word finally. In terms of the Republican Party, they've been on a long losing streak here. They didn't win everything on Tuesday, but they won some big ones, and they got back in the game. They made this a purple state again.
Penfield Tate, attorney with Greenberg Traurig, also a longtime state lawmaker. What's your one word for election night?
Misunderstood. People are trying to read tea leaves that aren't saying what they think they say.
I think that will certainly be the case as we move forward. Let's get to it. On Tuesday night, Cory Gardner became the first candidate since 1978 to defeat an incumbent U.S. Senator in Colorado, as he defeated Mark Udall. Most polls showed Gardner with a slim lead for a couple of weeks, but the race was called by most sources by 8:30 p.m. Lynn, this was an historic race, historic amounts of money put into it, and while it was a margin that was called at 8:30, it obviously has tightened as more votes have been counted. Let's stick with the Senate race. What are your big takeaways from how it came out?
Well, I thought it was interesting because I was at the Republican Party, and it was just like, you thought they'd won the lottery. But you have to realize the totals coming in that time showed Gardner winning by like 6%, Beaupre was up, they were beside themselves. They'd won, at that point, if you're looking at those returns, they'd won like 4 Senate seats or whatever, but everybody kept saying, why isn't Mark Udall conceding? Well, for the very reason that we're talking about the polls tightening, is because so many ballots were still out. And you look at this, Cory, I think, was up 6% on election night. He's down to 2.4% now. I mean, it was such a big hoopla, but in the end, he may be the senator from across the country in this incredible way for Republicans, this midterm bonanza, who wins by the smallest margin of victory as far as the races that all eyes were on. I mean, I just think it's fascinating. The Democrats' ground game wasn't enough to pull them over, but it was enough to make it really close. And I think, in hindsight, that's why Udall were waiting. They were like, we've got thousands of uncounted ballots. Adams County hasn't reported anything, which you might remember Adams County is kind of considered a Democratic stronghold. And instead, Udall barely hung on in Adams County, just like in Pueblo. Udall's ahead by like 389 votes in Pueblo.
Wow.
Bennett was ahead by like 10,000 votes in Pueblo. I mean, you had Adams and Pueblo underperforming for the Democrats. Meanwhile, you had explosion of voter turnouts in places like Douglas County and El Paso County.
David, it's our job, and it's a fun one, to be kind of the Monday morning quarterback, I guess in this case a Wednesday morning quarterback when we look back at the campaigns. But when you see the Gardner win, is it more about Gardner winning or Udall losing?
I think that the documentary about the Senate race will be called "It's Always Sunny in Cordydelphia." He was
well done. I like that.
He was a great candidate, and I think if he'd actually switched and had Beaupre run for Senate and Gardner for governor, Gardner would have won that one, and Beaupre would have lost the other one. He was outstanding. The only mistake he made in the whole campaign really was forgetting to go back and proofread all the bills he'd co-sponsored in the last and getting his name off that personhood thing, which did hurt him, especially his implausible explanations. Mark Udall gave a wonderful concession speech, and that was it really showed off Udall at his best, which is, as Gary Hart pointed out in the letter to the Huffington Post complaining about the Post endorsement, the really serious and constructive and inclusive side of Mark Udall. I think Udall lost for two reasons, one of which you should feel really good about. Tom Steyer, the billionaire, put a huge amount into this Next Gen Colorado thing to get people to vote because of climate change. Over 60 paid operatives in the state working on that issue to get out the youth vote. As it turned out, that was a low salience issue for most people. It just didn't, people weren't moving on that. But if Udall was going to pick a hill to fight and die on, that's certainly the sincere one based on his entire career and everything he believes in. What was less good as a place to fight it out was the whole gynecological side of his campaign, which worked at what it intended to do. He won single women by 5 points more than Obama did, and they were a higher share of the electorate than before. So the message got to that group he was trying to focus on, but I think it trivialized him to a lot of other voters because with its single-mindedness, and the epitome of that was another Steyer ad, the No Condoms for Sweet Pea tragedy, which just, I think it made a lot of other people who might have been undecided
Is that a Steyer's ad? I thought it was a NARAL ad.
Steyer paid the money.
It's all one and the same, like the Koch brothers. It's not AFP.
Right.
It's the Koch brothers.
Yeah, and I think that hurt him for other voters just by making him look not as serious as he actually is in real life.
Right. Erica, Dave brought up a good point about Udall's concession speech, and it was heartfelt, and the whole thing about the climbing pikes, the whole business. I felt that if that would have actually been an ad in mid-October, maybe he doesn't win, but it certainly shows some of the personality that I think Colorado got used to knowing Mark Udall. Cory Gardner, there's a lot of business about him always smiling, which is certainly part of his personality. I missed seeing Mark Udall smile for the last 8 months. Where do you look at it? Did Udall lose the race? Did Gardner win the race? What do you think?
Several thoughts in terms of did Udall lose or Gardner win? My answer is yes and yes. Those aren't polar opposites. In terms of the concession speech, I was going to say the same thing as you and David. I thought it was a wonderfully done, personable, heartfelt kind of speech. It was the Mark Udall that this state knew back in his congressional days when he ran for Senate 6 years ago. That part of Mark Udall got hidden here, and I don't know why it got hidden. I don't know if the burdens of the office took its toll on Mark, if the burdens of the campaign and running in what was obviously a tough environment took its toll, but he came across in this campaign as almost uniformly dour, put upon. Yes, Cory Gardner was always going to be the sweetness and light candidate, but he was able to do that even more effectively in contrast to Udall. So much to talk about here. I'll try to keep it brief, but David's right in terms of the Udall campaign that they only played. The Democratic playbook for a number of years has involved the war on women narrative, and it's been an effective part of the playbook, but it's only one chapter in the playbook. And it struck me that the Udall campaign threw away the rest of the playbook and just went all in on that one chapter. If this had been a Vegas scene, and TV stations now, it's all these World Series of Poker tournaments. It seems like every morning Mark Udall woke up and said, putting all my chips in, all in on this issue. And I never understood that. And any vote that was there to be had based on that issue, Mark Udall had in his column as of October 1st. And I think by continuing to just stay all in the last 5 or 6 weeks, it actually chased some of those votes away because people got tired of it. It was enough already. What else do you have? And it didn't allow a more robust campaign. The definition of a wave election is not that all people in one party win by overwhelming margins. It's that most elections, even the close elections, tip in one direction. So even though Gardner's final margin is only going to be 2-point-something%, that is typical of a wave election. I think the most important thing that needs to be said is that Gardner's win in many respects rescued the Republican Party in this state. Had it gone the other way, this would now be a moribund party. It would be an endless losing streak with no end of that losing streak in sight. And the energy, the money, everything would have gone out of that party. Does it change all of their fundamental challenges? No, they wake up with some of the same challenges they had before, but it at least allows them to live to fight another day.
Penn, I think Eric made a good point about the one-no campaign, but it was also a playbook that worked very well against Ken Buck just 4 years ago. But Ken Buck, I think, helped Michael Bennet by continuing to hamper himself. It didn't seem that Cory Gardner did Udall any favors, except I think what David brought up about his name still being the personhood bill. What do you make looking back at the U.S. Senate race?
You know, I think it's interesting, and that's why I started with the word misunderstood, because I think when all the votes are finally counted in Adams County and other places, what we're going to see is that Hickenlooper wins by a larger margin than Garner. And I think that voters are frustrated with what they perceive in Washington. And people talk about the president's approval rating at 40-some%. Congress's approval rating is even lower, as are Republican Congress members, which is even lower. So I think voters they don't quite know what they wanted, but they're saying we just want to switch things up. And I think that created an uphill climb for Udall. I do think that Mark had the right issue. And it's not the only issue, but it was the right issue. And you know it's the right issue when Cory started his campaign trying to inoculate himself on the issue by announcing and getting all this publicity for switching on personhood in the state. He didn't switch on personhood federally, and I think the Udall campaign tried to point that out. You know, in hindsight, I might have told them try a different ad that just says, you're lying, and put it in front of people plainly rather than focusing on the underlying substantive issue, which was reproductive rights. The real issue is you aren't telling the truth. You're saying one thing here, you're saying something differently. And you know you've got a seam you can work when the reporters at Fox TV are interviewing Cory, and they're saying, your explanation doesn't make any rational sense. You're trying to tell us the bill you're co-sponsoring doesn't exist, or it isn't what all of your colleagues say it is. But you know that it didn't happen, and so what I think we get caught up with Mark is that he had the right issue. He had several issues. You know, his concession speak was wonderful because that's who Mark Udall is. He reflects Colorado and the values in that fashion. But I think that some of the frustration of voters with Washington was so great, they didn't look beyond that. They didn't see that, and they weren't willing to look at it. And so I think people were sort of reacting to that. I think it is going to be fascinating. I think this is still misunderstood because as votes come in, if Cory's margin of victory, and I don't think there are enough votes to change that outcome. I don't think anybody's arguing that now. But if his margin continues to shrink, I think Republicans in the state would be well advised to understand this probably wasn't a mandate. A message, probably. A mandate, probably not. And finally is the turnout number. I think in 2010, we had about 1.8 million people voted in Colorado. The number's about the same, and I think most Democrats felt that in order to preserve Hickenlooper and Garner and control of the Colorado Senate, they were looking to hit the 2 million threshold or higher, and I don't think they quite got there.
The governor's race wasn't decided until 12 hours after the polls closed, but John Hickenlooper won a second term over challenger Bob Beaupre by nearly 3 points. Beaupre held a small lead for most of the evening, but overnight votes tallied in Denver and Boulder finally pushed Hickenlooper to victory. David, it seems Hickenlooper was leading most of the polls. It seemed an especially cruel way for them to lose by leading most of the night and waking up to the bad news. What do you make of the governor's race campaign and Governor Hickenlooper winning a second term?
Bring in somebody from Central Asia who doesn't speak English, and if you just had them watch the campaign and look at the people's demeanors, you would, as we talked about, Gardner would be the energetic, happy guy in the Senate race, and Udall came off as much more dour. I think that was reversed in the governor's race. The last time a Colorado governor lost a race for re-election was 1962 when Steve McNichols was beaten by a young Republican named John Love. And then in 74, John Vanderhoof, who had succeeded because the Governor Love went to the unfortunately be in Nixon's cabinet, was defeated in his first run for governor by a young and energetic guy with a strong vision for the state named Dick Lamb. I think the voters were open to change on the governor, but Beaupre failed to articulate enough of a concrete vision on that. He came with I think the whole strong leadership thing, which was it's sort of Romney-esque, of like, let's run on some poll-tested, virtue, where we don't have to get too substantive about that. It got him a good ways, but not far enough, and he would have had a better chance coming, and then the crime stuff that he focused on in the last week, I also think repelled voters. The Republican Governors Association ad, as Patty pointed out last week, was completely implausible, and it was in general this sort of negative tone, not enough of what needed to be a more constructive and detailed, optimistic vision for the state.
Eric, I know that John Hickenlooper had other he didn't organize obviously, but other 527s were doing the dirty work of going negative. So Hickenlooper was able to stay, like he always has been, a positive campaign. Did that create that rosy picture as a candidate that David spoke of?
I don't know if that was the critical variable. Hickenlooper had no choice but to do that because it was so definitional to his brand. I'm starting to scare myself a little bit here because I'm going to agree almost totally with David's analysis. Let me add a couple points. One to Penn's point, I actually think the turnout number is higher than you referenced, Penn. I think the turnout number I saw as of yesterday, with still some votes to be counted up in Adams County, was about 1.98 million. So I think the final number is going to be right at 2 million, plus or minus 10,000 one way or the other. The much touted Democratic ground game that everyone thought was going to rescue Mark Udall, well, I think it may have come to somebody's rescue here, but it was that person was John Hickenlooper and not Mark Udall. And that all of that effort in the final 48, 72, 96 hours was pretty critical for Hickenlooper. Would he have won without it? Maybe, but I think that it did save a seat. It was just not the Senate seat. It may have been the governor's seat. You have to ask yourself whether that seat was there for the taking and whether this really goes down as a missed opportunity for the Republican Party. In this kind of a wave year where Democrats are losing governor's chairs in deep, deep blue states like Maryland and Massachusetts and Illinois. Now, only one of those, Illinois, was at the expense of an incumbent, but nonetheless, you have to ask yourself, could the Republicans have pulled this off? I agree with the analysis that we heard from David about the Beaupre campaign. I thought it was lackluster even on a good day, and then the closing message was not what the situation needed. Hickenlooper's vulnerability was always around issues of leadership, decisiveness, everything in that family, and yet Beaupre chose to close with this weird crime and mayhem in the streets if Hickenlooper gets another 4 years, and it was just non-credible. Even the death penalty issue, in my mind, Hickenlooper's vulnerability on the death penalty, it wasn't a criminal justice issue, it was a decisiveness issue, and that was the way to approach it. So I thought it was a misstep and a missed opportunity.
Penn, John Hickenlooper is going to end up winning roughly by about 3 points, bigger than the margin that Cory Gardner is winning by. But it was pretty touch and go there for a while. We look back at it, what do you think?
I agree with much of what Eric said, except for his complete agreement with David. I think the seat was there for the taking, and I think Bob Beaupre is a good, decent, honest guy who the last time he ran had a horrible campaign and got beaten. And this time it was almost like his campaign put him in bubble wrap and told him not to bump into anything sharp. Mm-hmm. They didn't. I think if Bob would have been Bob, he would have been definitive about a few things that would have resonated with Coloradans. I think his campaign was afraid to let him be definitive about anything. Mm-hmm. And the one thing they picked toward the ends of the campaign was this ad that in many communities were reminiscent of the Willie Horton style of campaigning. We got to lock these people up because you're in danger. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe they're going there. And it's unfortunate because the seat was there, I thought, for the taking. I think Eric's right. I think even the Governor Hickenlooper supporters were concerned that whether it's the death penalty or some other things, he had not been decisive enough in his first 4 years, that he wavered, that he spent a lot of time trying to make everybody happy and ended up on some issues alienating everyone, which is why I think it was so close and we went so, until the next day to know, what the ultimate outcome was, because I think the governor was vulnerable. And so this is why I go back to misunderstood once again. In a wave year, when everything is clicking for the Republican Party, you've got an incumbent governor who barely holds on by 3 points and a U.S. Senate seat that shifts by barely 2.5, let's call it 2.5 points. I'm not convinced that Colorado is no longer a purple state. As a matter of fact, I think this reinforces the fact that it is. And if the Republican Party is back in the game, if they didn't get back in the game this election cycle, they weren't going to be back in the game for a long, long time. So this was all the chips to the middle of the table for them. They had to win a number of these races.
Lynn, if you have Corey up by 2 and Hickenlooper up by 3, it's a 5-point difference. What was the secret for
That's
Hickenlooper?
math.
What was the secret for Hickenlooper to pull that off?
You got it handled. Go ahead.
The personality thing that you talked about, I think, is big. If you go back to Beaupre, I always laugh because he talked about, can't make a decision. Got to make a decision. He couldn't decide for a year whether he was going to run. Mike Kopp got in and Tom Tancredo got in because he said he wasn't going to run. So I think the decision thing for me was always like, whoa, what's that? I will say that at our Denver Post gubernatorial debate, I was watching Bob, and I sat next to Claudia, and I wrote her a note and said, this is not the 2006 Bob. I thought he looked really good. Hickenlooper was sprawled all over, what do you ever call it, the lectern of the podium. And I mean, I was just sort of like, what is going on? And he flubbed the first question, and there's kind of a backstory to it, and I know why he flubbed it. But still, if you had left that night, other than the abortifacient, I'm hoping I'm saying this right, you were like, wow, this is really good for Bob. But at the end, this whole thing of, the Hickenlooper campaign had shirts made, how you have Angry Birds, they had Angry Bob. And I was on the road with Corey the Thursday before the election, and there was campaign stops in Pueblo and Colorado Springs. Well, the thing in Colorado Springs for Bob was just pure law enforcement. They had Southers there being very critical of Hickenlooper, which I was surprised at. Then you had the chiefs there and the district attorneys there, and it was just all sort of like this big law and order thing. And I'm sitting there, and Corey gets up and gives this great positive speech. And I think if Bob Beaupre's campaign had followed his lead, at that time they were tied, remember? We're doing good in the polls. Let's just go out with a happy note. But it was just sort of like you said, we're about to be, the Mongolian, hordes are about to invade us.
Right.
Careful, lock your doors.
Well, it's time for our favorite part of the show, Disgrace of the Week. Lynn is...
Wow, we already missed everything
I know,
else.
the half hour goes by pretty fast in the show. Lynn, start us off. And you can pick anything from this week or the whole election season. It's your choice.
I think some of the comments on Twitter are so over the top and so mean and so cruel. I mean, the comments about Udall's campaign manager, et cetera, it's just, you can have fun on Twitter, but it's just that anonymous just torture, slow torture. I think sometimes it's got some of it's so bad. At least if I, go after you, I got my name there with it.
That's right. David?
While we fiddle, the world is burning. Now it comes out that Obama has written 4 unanswered letters to the supreme tyrant of Iran, apparently saying, can we please be friends, want to talk? And doesn't even get a reply. We are on the way to an Iranian nuclear bomb. Candidate Obama promised in 2008 this would absolutely not happen. Another red line that has been blown away, and that's going to lead to real nuclear explosions in the world.
Eric?
Speaking of social media, maybe the president should have just friended him on Facebook. I thought, speaking of the president, I thought his news conference on Wednesday was, and this is not a disgrace, it's more of a disappointment. I thought it was not up to the moment. It was not the gravity of what had happened the day before. He seemed disengaged and not listening. I'm not suggesting the president needs to fold his tent and not use his executive powers and not stay true to his philosophy and his issues in the Democratic coalition. But for somebody who came to Washington promising to bridge the partisan divide and change the tone in Washington, and I understand it takes 2 dance partners to do that, and he hasn't even often had a dance partner to do that with. But he's still the president. There's only one of them at a time. And I don't think he did what was necessary to try to set the tone for at least, and to give the people of this country some hope. Lastly, Dominic, there are a whole lot of Democrats who bled because of Barack Obama's unpopularity in this election, and I think they deserved a little more energy and passion out of their chief executive in that post-mortem press conference.
Penn.
Well, he's going out much the way he came in, but Scott Gessler for picking Boulder County is the only place he had to go fix the election and save democracy.
I will add one thing, though, is that every election night we're waiting for Boulder. I mean, I don't know if it's new computers, if it's whatever it is.
Scott helped a lot this time.
Okay,
yeah.
all right. I'll give him credit there. Say something nice about somebody rather quickly. Lynn, go ahead.
Mark Udall, like they said, the speech. In fact, Colorado, the Republicans told me, oh my God, if that guy had showed up on the campaign trail, we would have been in trouble. It was so beautiful. It was so Mark. And that's the guy I saw when I campaigned with him, just not the guy you saw in the ads.
David.
My former Rocky Mountain News media co-columnist Jason Saltzman, Oppo researcher extraordinaire. He was the guy who found and publicized initially the Gardner federal personhood bill, and he is the guy who broke the Scott McGinnis water plagiarism scandal in 2010.
Wow. Eric.
Did not know either of those. Roxanne White, Governor Hickenlooper's departing chief of staff throughout the first term. I'm not sure her little gesture at the press conference on Wednesday is, that she wants that to be her.
No, we cannot.
That she wants that to be her epitaph, and it won't be her epitaph. Roxanne has been as effective a chief of staff as any governor has had in a long period of time, is a force of nature, a humanitarian, as well as a powerhouse, and good for her.
Penn.
2 people, Mark Udall and Bob Beaupre. 2 guys I like. I don't always agree with everything they do, but I never question their sincerity and their commitment to the people of the state of Colorado.
Well, that is all the time we have for tonight. Thanks for tuning in. I want to thank all of you that helped make our historic election debate season possible. We were proud to bring our statewide audience over 20 hours of debates and analysis, including 3 hours of live election night coverage with our partners at CBS4. A special thanks to my friend Eric Sonderman, who co-hosted all those debates with me, and our crew here at Channel 12, who I believe are some of the most educated voters in the state, seeing how many folks they see come through the studio. And finally, thank you for helping to make Channel 12 Colorado's perennial source for in-depth election coverage. For everyone here at Channel 12, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Hi, I'm Larry, audio guru and time machine producer for Colorado Inside Out. Today I'm in my role as audio guy. I've just received the lineup for today's episode of Colorado Inside Out. And the first thing I'm going to do here is actually make sure all my microphones are working.
Besides, if you're into a bar, talk to mic.
Got 5 microphones working here, and as you could probably hear in the background, we hear background chatter and all of those things. The next thing I'm going to do here, this mixer we have, digital console, actually has the ability to remember the different participants in our shows on there. So what I'm going to do now is go in and find here in the list all the people that will be participating in today's show. David Kopel, Patricia Calhoun, the queen of the show, the actual true star of the show, Dominic, the new and engaging host taking over from the popular Raj Chauhan. And now all those people's voices, the tunings that I've created for those individuals, have been entered into the board, and I've got them to where they'll sound at their absolute best when the show starts. If you watch the shows here, you'll note that the microphones are typically on the side facing the host if someone's on a lapel. That's so when they turn to Dominic, there's a mic between them and Dominic. If they turned the other way, he'd be gone. If I put the mic over here and he's talking at Dominic, we don't really hear him. If I have the chance and someone's wearing a tie and I expect they're going to be turning to both ways in the audience, we'll try and place it on the tie. If you see that, somebody on the tie, it was because it was either really convenient and easy to hang it on their tie, or because we expected they'd be having to turn both ways to address different panelists. And so that ensures that we pick them up. The next step in the process is to go get a cup of coffee and talk to Dominic.
Hey, Simon, how are you? Well, it's good to see you. We're having our usual Friday cup of coffee, and it's always, as always, it's a kind of Larry and Dominic tradition, if you will. It's some of Columbia's finest, if you will, but it's what makes CIO what it is. It's something where everyone has to be on their toes. That's there's nothing there.
It's all about the beans, man.
It's always been about the beans. You ever want to know what the secret behind Cards I Have is? Good coffee.
I'd like to thank my agent and to all the members of the Academy for making this possible.